Hello and welcome to the Klassiki podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your window into the world of Eastern European film. Subscribers gain access to our library of classic and contemporary titles, as well as filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, and much more. You can sign up for a free trial today at klassiki.online. And if you enjoy the show, then don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app, and please leave us a review and a 5-star rating. Thank you. This week, we're trying something new on the pod. The first edition of what we're tentatively calling the Klassiki Kino Club. We wanted to find a way of championing our ever-growing library of films with you, our listeners. So I thought I'd ask a friend of the show to pick a title available on Klassiki that they had never seen before to watch for the first time, and then to jump on a call with me to offer their reactions and reflections. With this in mind, I reached out to Alisa Goruleva. Alisa is a Russian film critic and researcher based in Berlin, who's recently been writing some wonderful pieces for us over on the Klassiki Journal. Her choice of film was Confidence, the 1980s study in paranoia and desire from Hungarian master István Szabó. We got into her reaction to the film's slippery central romance, its take on gender power dynamics, and how it relates to Szabó's other work. Hopefully you'll feel inspired to check out the film and to start exploring our library for yourselves. So follow the links in the show description to watch along with us on Klassiki and to read some of Alisa's writing for us on the journal. And leave us a review to let us know which films you'd like us to tackle next in the Klassiki Kino Club. Thank you very much. Alisa, thanks for joining us on the Klassiki podcast for this new format, the Kino Club. How are you doing?
I'm pretty excited, actually. Yeah.
Well, that's hope we don't disillusion you. So the film, I got in touch with you and I said, Alisa, come on the podcast, and then I gave you this opportunity, this great opportunity to pick a film from the Klassiki library to watch that you hadn't seen before. And the film that you plumped for was István Szabó's Confidence from 1980. So what did you know about Szabó going into this? Did you know anything about the film? And why was that the film that you went for?
So actually, I didn't know anything about the film except that it was directed by István Szabó. And, well, I've seen a few of Szabó's films before. I've seen his German trilogy and I've seen his earlier films. I was a bit familiar with the context of Hungarian cinema, as this part of the Eastern European bloc. And their tendency to reflect and reframe this big events of 20th century with wars,
Yeah.
revolution, regimes that were constantly changing. So I was kind of interested in that. And Confidence, it also kind of opened the window for discovering more of István Szabó's work, because I need to confess that after I watched Confidence, I went straight on watching his other films that I haven't seen. So by now, I've seen a lot. And it's also kind of surprising that I don't know how much of you may, tell about this later, but I feel like Confidence is a sort of a landmark film for Sabo. It's a kind
Yeah.
of it bridges his earlier films that are a bit more experimental. They're not that linear. They have a lot of flashbacks, and his later these big historical dramas like Mephisto, Sunshine, Taking Sides, and, well, many others. Yeah, and it was like interesting to see the confidence as this bridge also.
Yeah, I think that's how people tend to describe it when they're being, schematic about his career. It's this inflection point, this turning point. I think if people are, I mean, we can get a little bit into who István Szabó was and like his place in Hungarian cinema. But for people who are aware of him, like you say, they might be aware of him for this trilogy of films he made in the 80s, which are these kind of grand political, almost supernatural allegories in this quite stylized register. And like you say, he comes out of this slightly more experimental, urban, everyday life kind of school of Hungarian filmmaking before that. And then Confidence is this, it's very pared back. I've read that he kind of got fed up with people claiming that his films were a bit incomprehensible. So he really decided to kind of pare things back. It's very minimal whilst being quite complex. And it really sets him up, I think, for those later films, which are, yeah, like I said, these kind of it's political allegories. It's not an allegory, but it is like deeply concerned with these kind of political, spiritual questions that he would go on to explore. So, seeing as you're now the resident expert in István Szabó, how would you describe him just as a director, just for people who are maybe vaguely familiar with Hungarian film, but couldn't kind of put a name to a face with Szabó himself?
Well, I think you've already said a bit that could explain Saba to, to the audience, because he was kind of a director who was always concerned with the themes, of political identity, of your personal identity. And he looked at these themes through the lens of this big, history that was happening around him, because he was born in late 30s, and well, he witnessed every big twist that happened to Hungarian history in the 20th century. He survived World War II when he was a child. Then there was the communist regime. He was only a student, a film student, when the 1956 revolution happened, when people tried to protest against the communist regime. And well, we know for a fact that he was an informer for Hungarian police, that he was forced to in order to protect one of his friends. So it was also like a very traumatic, experience. And then he was already a famous director when the Soviet regime, well, it fell. And what is also important is that he was a Jew, and although his parents, they were converted, they were Catholics, but Nazis still considered him a Jew. So the years of war were very, traumatic for him. His family had to separate, to hide, and this theme of hidden or repressed identity, I think it's one of the like most important theme for him. And yeah, it always feels like his films, there are like two big questions, like who are you and what's happening around you, and how does this world around you try to reshape or redefine who you are and what you can do, or why can you do nothing to fight back. So that's always kind of existential dilemmas that
Yeah,
his characters are forced to face.
I really like that way of putting it, those two questions. And yet, the word you use there, existential, is the word that was really at the top of my mind when I was watching Confidence. So yeah, I mean, you mentioned it there. So Sabo was from a Jewish family who had converted to Catholicism, but then during the kind of the fascist period during the Second World War, they were still considered Jewish. And so I think he would have been 6 or 7, maybe, at the end of the
Like,
war. And like you say, he had to go into hiding. His father died while he was in hiding, I think. And when you watch Confidence, if you're aware of that biographical detail, it becomes really relevant, to put it mildly. All right, well, that's Sabo. So let's just kind of set up the film. We're going to obviously be dealing in some spoilers here. So listeners,
yeah.
you get onto Klassiki, watch Confidence, and then come back to this, pause it and come back. So the film takes place in this period right at the end of the Second World War. So it's like the autumn winter of 1944, 1945, which was when Hungary was, there was a puppet fascist government in Hungary. It was effectively under Nazi occupation. And at the start of the film, this woman, Kata, played by Ildiko Banshagi, she's coming out of a cinema and she is accosted on the street by a strange man who tells her husband has had to go on the run. He's obviously involved in some kind of anti-Nazi resistance cell. And she is ferreted away to this house on the outskirts of Budapest, where she is told that she will have to adopt a new identity and pretend to be the wife of another resistance member she's never met before. called Janos, played by Petar Andrei, and they're going to have to live together in this room, pretending to be husband and wife, as they basically kind of hide in plain sight from the Nazis and from the fascist collaborators. And then the film plays out as this largely quite kind of claustrophobic chamber drama about these two people forced together into this very intimate and psychologically damaging situation and it's about the kind of development, the ebb and flow of kind of trust and confidence, as the title puts it, between the two of them and the relationship that develops. So that's the skeleton outline. What's your kind of initial reaction to the film? What's the first thing that you would say if you came out of the cinema and turned to your friend, having watched Confidence? What's the first thing that you would say?
Well, I guess I would, use the same word, claustrophobic and kind of traumatic, because it does feel like a sort of psychological experiment that is put on these two characters. And even though the reality can be, it's sort of distant and cold, the characters are always, they're present in front of you, and their struggle is very vital and real. And this state of not knowing the truth and what's happening around you, it's very frustrating. And I guess Sabo masterfully plays with it, maybe because it's such it's basically a chamber piece, like you said.
Mm.
It's mostly happening in one room, and it's mostly these two characters trying to figure out if, well, they can trust each other, if they can connect to each other. And it is very traumatic and claustrophobic indeed. But also it's a very interesting disposition of personal and this larger historical context when we know it's like the end of the war, we know what's happening outside, but still the thing that is happening with this two character, I don't know how you felt it, but for me it felt a bit like a mirage or an illusion, like as if it was a unreal circumstances
Yeah,
in which they have to perform. Maybe it's because the way, it is shot with the lighting and this Vermeer kind of compositions and blocking, but sometimes it just doesn't feel real. It feels like there's sick fantasy or whatever.
I know what you mean. It's like they're sequestered from the war. Like there's very little. They're nominally kind of tied up in this resistance to fascist occupation, but there's very little sense of the war. The only time we actually see quote unquote war is in a couple of points where Sabo uses newsreel footage. So we're really taken out of it any time there's anything that would be the bones of
Mhm.
a traditional war movie. And there's this sense that like you say, they've kind of been sequestered and they're being subjected to this cruel psychological experiment. And then occasionally other people's very real problems kind of intrude, but are quickly kind of shunted to one side again. I think it's really important to mention the lighting. I was watching it again before this. I was so struck by particularly kind of the first half. He uses this really brutal, unpleasant lighting. Like it's kind of terrible. Like if you were trying, obviously he's doing it on purpose, but if it had been an accident, then it would have been terrible. It's very, very bright exposed electric lights that really kind of flood the frame. Really harshly lit, kind of backlit windows that really obscure our sense of what's going on in the room. And then contrasting those with these nighttime scenes, which are gorgeously kind of cool and dark and make a beautiful use of shadows. It's a real kind of blend of deliberate ugliness and then these moments of real kind of calm composition.
So I think it's like a very interesting dynamics that's happening between the characters. We mostly see the story through, well, the experience of Kata, because like she's the character who like leads us to the story,
Yeah.
and this frustration that she has and this fragility, it's a very, very special, state that she has. So the other man, Janos, at some point you you even feel like he's torturing her when there's a scene in the beginning somewhere in the first part of the film where he wakes her up at night
Oh, by
and makes
shining a
her,
flashlight in her
yeah,
face. Yeah.
and he's making her repeat her false biography because he wants to make sure that she is prepared, that she is ready. But the way it is done, obviously, it feels like, a torture for her. You feel almost zero sympathy towards that other man trapped with her.
Yeah,
But
it's like
then,
she's already in prison.
exactly, and you definitely see like this power structure because it's all, I mean, it's all about the power dynamics and the power structures, even, you know, and I'm not only talking about this larger context of war and them being repressed by this war, but also even like the resistance movement that also, keeps her unknown of what's happening with her husband and with her kid and putting her in this circumstances. It also feels kind of aggressive on their
Oh, yeah,
side.
definitely.
And you feel like she's been constantly controlled by someone else, and it feels wrong. And there's this marvelous scene towards the end of the film where she meets her husband, and well, throughout the film, she keeps asking how is he, and it's obvious that they have some, you know, special relationships. But when they meet, he keeps on treating her as a child as well. He gives her that pet name of teddy bear, and he tells her that she's a child. And we see that, well, he's also, there's also sort of power dynamics between them. So the only point when there are no power dynamics is in this chamber when the Janos opens up to her and to us. And somewhere in the middle of the film, we realize that the reason why he's so frightened and scared is because he did have the traumatic experience of, well, being betrayed by the loved one.
Yeah,
He,
his ex-girlfriend was a
yeah, great.
German who
Yeah,
shopped him to the Gestapo at the beginning of
which is pretty
the
traumatic.
30s.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you could have some trust
Yeah.
issues after that,
Oh,
definitely.
yeah, certainly. Yeah, I think it's the contrast that the film is structured around at first is between Kata being very nervous, kind of tremulous. She's been thrown into this situation. She's not a kind of trained spy or resistance agent. She's constantly cracking up or kind of asking about her child and her husband. And then Janos is this seasoned operator. He's very harsh and firm. You know, he forces her to burn her only photo of her husband and flush the ashes down the toilet. He does this kind of torture routine on her in the middle of the night. He's very strict. And then the development of the film is realizing where strength and kind of fragility lie with each of them, and that actually she's not as afraid as he has in certain ways. That there's a lot of play on the idea of kind of fear and cowardice and bravery and where you actually locate that. Because yeah, like you say, Janos actually, his harshness is a reflection of this insecurity and this fragility that he has. I think it's also like what you're saying about her relationship with her husband. The whole thing also works totally as like an allegory for heterosexual relationships. Like the whole thing is like a psychological experiment designed to bring out the power dynamics of straight couples. Because the whole thing is, like you say, her being controlled and shepherded around this city by a series of men, some of whom she's never met, and her gradually realizing, hang on a sec, like these guys have, there's nothing to them. These guys are all paper tigers, and I'm the only one who's actually kind of fully emotionally evolved, really.
But yeah, but then there's like this interesting, question. This love affair that happens between these two characters. What is it? I mean, is it does it happen because they were, so good of portraying married couples, so they decided to blur this boundary? Well, I mean, obviously not. Is it because they're so desperate? I think like that's the answer. Both of them are frightened and, well, frustrated and scared of what's going to happen. This love affair seems to be it's because the film is obviously not a love story as I see it's not a love story. There's obviously some melodramatic elements to it, but it's not a love story.
It's not
And
exactly a meet cute, is it? Their setup.
definitely. So this passion, this romance, this love that happens between them, it's also, I don't know, it feels like a way of escapism because in this world, when they are put together, they are forced to, trust each other and they don't know anything about what's happening. It's the only way to find confidence in something. It's, the confidence they can have in each other. So that's why this love story feels a bit hysterical,
Yeah.
and I don't want to say sick, but it's definitely not a sweet romance.
No, I think you'd have to be looking at it from a very peculiar angle to locate sweetness in it. I think what you're saying is really important. So there's one scene which is really crucial in this regard, which is they have one of their rare sorties out of their this kind of safe house where they're staying, and they're in a cafe, and a woman recognizes Gata, a woman who knew her from school, and kind of accosts her in the toilet in the bathroom to ask if she'll help her. And it's not explicit, but it's heavily implied that this woman is Jewish and she's asking Kata to help her hide. And Kata just kind of has to pretend to be oblivious, or she chooses to pretend to be oblivious. It's left ambiguous. And this Jewish woman kind of explodes at her and calls her a coward and says, like, I hope your children hate you. This is, how dare you do what you've done to us, and kind of storms out. And it's this really rare intrusion into their little claustrophobic world of this much bigger tragedy and this much bigger crime that's occurring around them. And it's really important because, like you say, it helps you to realize how much they're living in a fantasy world. Not particularly nice fantasy world, obviously, but like they are living in a fantasy world. And outside of the walls of this house that they're stuck in is the literal Holocaust. It's a really kind of powerful, it's a really powerful scene.
Yes, and I think that to add to this weirdness of this relationship, it revolves really fast. Like there's this scene when they're lying in a bed and they're starting sharing scars with each other, like they're telling the stories of their scars and opening up to each other. And it's, it feels as a childish gesture, as if they're, kids on a playground,
Yeah, yeah.
but very intimate at the same time. And well, I think that's like the mixture of this something very fragile and intimate, but at the same time very infantile is what they are forced to experience together. And that's kind of their, I don't want to say tragedy, but the trauma, this experience. And this experience, I mean, it's obviously like the World War II and the the resistance, like we can talk about different power sources, but they're all affecting them. It's hard to, it's hard to pin it down to only the Holocaust or, you know, anything else.
Yeah, that scene when they're in bed it's another one of these turning points in the film. Like you say, it happens very quickly. They're very antagonistic towards one another, and then very quickly they're sleeping together. And the turning point is that there's one night where someone in the neighborhood is getting arrested by the fascist police, and they're watching out the window because they think maybe they're coming for them. And in that moment, they both admit to one another they're terrified. And Janos, who has been very frosty up to this point, says, "Well, at least we can be afraid together." And from that point on, they basically fall into each other's arms. And like you're right, there is something childish about that. It's kids holding hands in the dark, and then obviously it develops from there.
In this episode that we already talked about when, the night torture routine and the intensity of it, well, it made me think about, Costa Gavras political thrillers because it's
Yeah.
very physical and demanding. But apart from that, what would you?
So I was thinking of like Melvi and like Army of Shadows, like that again, like the because I was thinking about that kind of existential thing that Melville does, where basically anytime you meet any other human, you are like fatally compromised. and you're basically guaranteeing one another's death by having any contact at all. But
Well, you mentioned that the reality is kind of a blurred away, and we see the traces of war only through those, newsreels. And yeah, I was thinking that the film actually begins with one of this newsreel. Um,
that's true, yeah.
so as we, enter the film, the war is right there in front of our eyes. It's vividly present and well unfolding right here. But when the main character who was watching this newsreel in the cinema, she leaves the cinema and we, go out to the streets with her, we notice that outside the world appear empty, almost unreal and kind of obscure, and there is very little human presence. So the war is, it's very distant, but yet this war is the substance that determines the conflicts and the fates of the characters and their struggles and tragedies.
That's right. And just briefly on what you said there about the streets being empty, it's true. Every time they leave their safe house and we have an exterior shot, an external shot, the streets are totally empty. It's really unnerving. It's really uncanny. And I was saying to you before we started recording that I just been watching some David Cronenberg last night, and it really reminded me of the sensation you get in a Cronenberg film of the streets being kind of depopulated and the sense of where is everybody. That uncanny, slightly kind of horror movie feel. But yeah, it's a really effective way of capturing the sense that something is off. Obviously, in this instance, what's
Yeah.
off is Nazi occupation. We should also touch briefly on the ending, which I think
Mhm.
produces another gear shift, which I found really effective. So at the end of the film, spoiler alert, the Nazis lose the Second World War, and the communists kind of rush into this vacuum. And there's this really affecting scene where Kata is sat before this kind of little committee of, we have to presume, kind of communist bureaucrats, these four middle-aged men, and they're all staring directly down the lens. And she's trying to get her old identity papers back because she's been living under an assumed name with fake documents. And they're just kind of haranguing her with all these questions about Janosch's and hers kind of political sympathies. What newspapers does Janosch read? Who's he friends with? Has he suffered sufficiently for the leftist cause and so on? And she's completely kind of frozen that she can't answer, and she just leaves and goes back and eventually then is reconciled with her husband. But it's a really, I think, kind of affecting and upsetting ending because there's absolutely no sense of victory at all. The streets look the same, the people look just as tired and exhausted, and one oppressive power structure, for Kata at least, has just been replaced by another.
Yeah, I think that's truth because there's definitely no sense of victory. And well, throughout the film, we see how different men are telling Kata what to do or showing her some sort of control over her. And the ending is, just the same. But what is like more, I don't know, heartbreaking is that she is sitting there and trying to get her identity as Janusz's wife, which she's obviously not. And so in the beginning of the film, she was forced to change her identity to pretend someone she's not. And in the end of the film, she's kind of she's already connected with this new identity because it gave her Janusz
Yeah.
and their, their relationship. And maybe this was a bit, because it was a necessity, obviously, but it gave her feelings and it gave her a sense of life, which was unimaginable in the circumstances. And she was ready to, to take this identity. But once again, she is, she's being left with a new one. So she's once again torn apart and she's forced to, because after that scene, we see her reunited with her husband. And it's a kind of a brutal ending for her and for Janusz as well, because they kind of lose each other after they found peace with each other.
Yeah, she loses both her identities by the end of the film. So that's, yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty much it. I mean, that's Confidence by István Szabó, Before we go, I wanted to ask, because like you said, you've been watching a bunch of his other films as well. If people wanted to continue exploring Szabó's works, where would you recommend that they go next?
Well, I'm a huge fan of the German trilogy with Klaus Maria Brandauer because it does give you this huge, overwhelming experience of the history and the very precise human tragedies that happens through it. So I would definitely, if you haven't seen it, go see it. But I am also a huge fan of Szabó's earlier films, like The Age of Illusions, which is a very nuanced and very smart and vital portrayal of his own generation, and the conflicts and the dramas that happens to it. And it does remind me some of the Soviet 60s films, but also it's very fresh and very, obviously inspired by the French New Wave because Saba and his classmates often spoke about how they were influenced by the French cinema. And you can definitely see that in The Age of Illusions. So this is another one that I would recommend, but probably after Confidence, you should go watch István Szabó's film called Father. It's it's a story. It's a kind of a autobiographical story about a boy who lost his father after the war, and he trying to recollect his memory about his father, and at the same time he's trying to figure out who he is, and it's also very complex, structure of identity and trying to figure out who you are in this world that, the country that has just survived Nazis and then communists. So it's a very emotional and it's a great film. So I would recommend you go watch it.
Yeah, and like we were saying, once you're aware of Szabó's biography, then a film like Confidence, and especially this film you're describing, Father, really take on an extra level of poignancy. And I would just say, if people want to stay on Klassiki, which obviously you should, if you can, and we're interested in some films that would pair well with Confidence, two films I'd suggest. The first one is another Hungarian film by Zoltán Fabry called The Fifth Seal, which is also set in this period of fascist occupation at the end of the Second World War, and is also concerned with these questions of fear and bravery and the political consequences of them. And then the other film I'd recommend, a Ukrainian film, another Second World War film, this time in Nazi-occupied Ukraine. The Nazis got around, and that is Conscience by Volodymyr Denisenko, which is a partisan film. So slightly more in the traditions of the war film, but I think has the same existential tone as Confidence. A really fantastic film. So check out those two on Klassiki. And I think we'll call it a day for now there. Alisa, thanks for joining me for the first Klassiki Kino Club, and I'm sure we'll see you again soon for another installment.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.